Hello, welcome to Not Another Who Review podcast. I'm Sam Morrell, and
I am Tom Baker, as you can see. No, I'm Chris Hyde.
hello. How are you, Chris?
I'm alright. I'm not too bad. How are you?
I'm good.
Surviving, thriving, and jiving?
Something like that. We had a few technical issues.
Yeah.
Trying to record this damn podcast.
Well, the thing is, it kind of makes a statement for Doctor Who in itself, let's be honest.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Doctor Who has been mired with production errors and the first episode being trashed because it was too dark and then they had to re-record it. And so, you know, if anything, we're following in its footsteps.
Exactly. And throughout the Graham Williams era, it had loads of production issues. It even got cancelled at some point, like Sharda.
That is true. Yeah, that is very, very true. But today, we aren't talking Sharda, we're talking...
The War Games.
The War Games.
So,
as a first
Chris,
episode, why we're starting with the last episode of a Doctor, I don't know, but it's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. So, Chris, tell me about yourself. How did you get into Doctor Who?
So, I come from the generation of Doctor Who fans that started watching the series back in 2005 when it was first broadcast. During the Russell T Davies 1 era, as it's dubbed. I actually fell into it by accident because I've always been into like folk stories. I love Robin Hood, I love King Arthur, I love all that kind of jazz. And I was playing with my friends outside one day. One of them wasn't coming out, and I thought I'd go around their house to see, you know, what was up. And it was a Saturday. It was, I think, March, or was it April? I don't know. And I think it was the episode Dalek that I remember watching for the first time and just being like, what the bloomin' heck is this? And just being encapsulated by it. And, you know, after 45 minutes, I was hooked, and that's where it all started. How about you?
Well, I grew up during a time where there was no new Doctor Who. Well, it was new to me, but it was in that wilderness period where there was no new Doctor, no new episodes, and I kind of fell into it while watching a repeat on a satellite channel called UK Gold.
Yes, UK TV Gold.
Yeah, though back then it was called UK Gold.
Yes, because UK TV was sort of established more or less the 2000s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like 2003-04 kind of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you are the wilderness generation, technically.
Exactly. I'm a couple of years older than you, so.
Yes. It doesn't show.
No, we could be mistaken to be the same age.
The twins?
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So what? So you basically grew up on Classic Who, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when Doctor Who returned in 2005, was that a big sort of jump for you, or?
I was like, oh wow, there's I'm going to have my own Doctor, which
Yeah.
became Christopher Eccleston. I
Mm.
I thought before Christopher Eccleston was cast, I thought they had to bring back Paul McGann, who was
Yes, that was
that
that
the
was
eighth
the
Doctor.
sort of thing.
They went in a different direction and kind of not reboot
Skip
it.
date.
It was just like, let's start with a new Doctor.
A clean slate.
Yeah, clean slate. And we're in the 20th year of New Who, so
Yes, 20
yeah,
years ago. How time flies. No pun intended.
it makes me feel ancient.
Makes you feel ancient. I still think it's 15 years ago. My brain hasn't moved on from like 2016 or something like that.
No,
2015, 2010. I don't know. But
yeah, I still think it's 2010.
yeah.
When I'm like 18, 19, I was in that grumpy
So
teenage stage.
so when did you first watch the War Games then? Was that during the Wilderness years, just after?
It was after the series came back when it got released on DVD.
Yes. 2009, I think.
So yeah, 2009. It wasn't one of them stories I had on VHS.
No, no. Oh, okay. Well, I think for me, I think I watched it first time during lockdown. Maybe even before, I can't remember. But I remember watching it and thinking, this is good. It's long, but it's good. Um, and then it was only until we, decided to do the podcast that I gave it another rewatch,
Mm,
and it's become not one of my favorites, but it has become a better story by
mm.
sort of comparison to like the new series, for example.
Yeah, I think it's in my like bottom 20, maybe.
Mm. So why did you choose this episode to start off the podcast?
Um, I don't know actually. It was just a random. Well, the colorization came out quite recently, so I thought,
Yes, just before Christmas.
yeah, it was like 23rd,
Yeah,
24th,
yeah.
something like that. And I thought, yeah, let's get the extra long story out the way.
Yes, definitely.
10 parts.
And do you think it still holds up by modern standards?
Uh, it's one of them stories that doesn't drag as much as like some of the 6 or 7 or 8 parters that are around.
Hmm.
Like, for example, Frontier in Space.
Yeah,
Have you seen Frontier in Space?
I haven't, no. This is
Well,
the problem, is I've only seen a scatter, a handful of classic episodes. So for me, it's going to be more of an experience in this podcast for me learning new episodes and you getting my first ever sort of reactions to them.
yeah,
Luckily, we've
that
started off with one I know.
that would that would actually be quite an interesting journey for you to go on. And me introducing you
Mm,
to these stories. Yeah, the Frontier in Space is like
uh,
it's. I just find it such a drag. It's like Joe and the Doctor getting locked up every 10 minutes, and the master getting up to who knows what. It's we'll get
That
to it at
troublesome
one point.
master.
Yeah, we'll get to it at one point.
So what's your sort of overall judgment of this story?
Yeah, it's one of them stories that doesn't drag as much. It does drag like maybe around 5 or 6. It's like when we get to like the Civil War stuff.
Yeah.
I find it drags.
Sorry.
Yeah, I find it drags a bit there, but then it picks
Yeah.
up and gets on back on pace again.
Yeah, I see it as very similar to like Torchwood Miracle Day, where it's overall it's a long story, but there are a few good episodes that really sort of push the story forward, and there's some that kind of just fill in for the sake of filling in.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think the performances are strong, at least.
Yeah. This is Patrick Troughton's last story.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think of Patrick Troughton's Doctor in this story and beyond?
Well, that's very interesting question, because for me, most of his stories are lost to time, no pun intended. And it's interesting because when you do see Troughton's performance, you really do see not the actor but the actual character come through. And I think that's safe to say for most of the actors that have took on the role. I think there's only been a couple of actors who I feel not really embody the Doctor enough, or highlight the traits that we all come to know and love with the Doctor. I'm not going to mention any names because they'll pop up in future episodes, so stay tuned. Yeah, I have to say, Troughton had one of the most daunting tasks of taking over such a role, but without him, we wouldn't have had the rest. So he was more the building block of what would come later. But at the same time, his Doctor is solid. The stories may be a bit hit and miss, but he remains a constant in that era. Same with his companion Jamie. Like, they are a definitive duo.
Yeah, Jamie appeared in all of them except for Power of the Daleks, his first story.
Yeah.
So
but then that's fair enough.
Yeah, he was there for pretty much the entire run of the Troughton era.
So obviously we've said about it's Troughton's last story. Do you think it was wise of the production to make such a large scale story, or do you think in hindsight that either it could have been trimmed down or split into 2 separate stories?
Well, this is what the 10-part story was for. It was like a 6-part story, then a 4-part story, or the other way around. I don't know which way around it was. It was to like fill in that gap because the script editor Terence Dix, he was like trying to like fill in the gaps for Troughton's last couple of stories. So two became one. That's how that 10-part story came about.
Because I think it would have made more sense if they maybe had split it up into two separate stories instead of having one large one, because then you could have condensed the story down, or you could have had the two stories still connect to one another but be different. So I think that's my only criticism in terms of its length and scale, is that I feel like they were too ambitious to try and put everything in, only for, because a lot of fans will say that it is just a drag, and it's one of those stories where you have to be in the right mood to watch it. So I do think, in hindsight, the production should have had a bit more of an idea of how to really engage the audience, and either throw back to the classic episodes, maybe a couple of Hartnell villains reappear, or some of the early Troughton villains reappear, because we get the sense of like the war chief and the warlord, but they don't have a lot of characterization, and they kind of just feel like villains for the sake of villains.
Yeah. Yeah, going towards like the colorization, that they kind of made the warlord the master, and I don't like that bit.
Don't worry, we'll get on to that. I have some questions lined up for that.
Yeah, just going on to that, the colorization, I was like, oh no.
Don't worry, we'll hit that burden when we get there. But do you agree that modern writers lack what classic writers had?
Yeah. Some of the writers had a lot of like different life experiences, just coming out of World War II, and they kind of brought them life experiences to their writing. Like Robert Holmes, I think he was an RAF. He was in the I can't speak today. The
Royal Air Force.
Yeah, the Royal Air Force. That's it. Yeah, I think he was.
There we go.
In that, and a policeman. So he brought that his life experiences to the writing. To
Same with Terry Nation as well.
Yeah.
And I feel like with modern writers, they either play things too safe, or and are afraid to take risks like classic writers did, or yes, as you say, in terms of experience. But I feel like in terms of like for example, Doctor Who's budget, writers had to be constrained to not writing too much that they would below the budget. Often they would with some stories. That's why some stories would have recommissioned sets, or sets that they would just tweak, and like the famous Ark in Space. So like Doctor Who's budget, especially in the classic era, was always small compared to the likes of Star Trek and Star Wars and other shows and projects of that time. With that in mind, do you think Doctor Who is better with a limited budget rather than having too much money to play with?
Yeah, that's kind of my criticism for new Doctor Who. It's going a bit too large and expansive, and
Yeah.
I'm one of them people who likes them dark claustrophobic stories that is like set in like a couple of places.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the Base Under Siege stories that the Troughton era was famous for.
Yeah, because I think that's the main takeaway with watching Classic Who is it feels more like you're watching a televised play than you are watching a manufactured, episode of television. It's supposed to be more performative, especially in the 60s where everything was recorded live. It was very much more of the sort of play of the week kind of thing. And I feel like with the problem with New Who is, especially with the Disney New Who, is
Yeah.
they have way too much budget and they have way too much. It's almost like they've got too many cooks on the project, and they're going, "How can we make this better than everything?" And Doctor Who was never like that. Doctor Who knew its place in science fiction. It knew that it had its campy side, which isn't, a bad thing. It had its pulpy sort of horror-esque weird science vibe. Whereas nowadays it just feels very sanitized or
Produced.
overproduced, maybe.
Yeah.
With that sort of, throwing that out there, how Troughton's stories, most of them are lost. Do you think they should either keep animating the stories, or would you prefer that they maybe take the original scripts and maybe modernize them so a new Doctor takes on that episode?
I like what they're doing with the animations. Not all of them. There's a few exceptions, like
Yeah.
the Web of Fear Part 3.
Yeah.
Have you seen
And the
that?
Celestial Toymaker. I have seen the Web of Fear, and I do get your criticisms, but I kind of think the BBC don't only like to throw money around when it feels like it will suit them, and they've always had this attitude with Doctor Who where, we'll just give them a limited budget, or we'll give them a limited amount of time for them to do whatever, and it never ends well, as opposed to actually funding them properly and giving them enough time to finish the story. And then they make really gaudy looking versions like the Celestial Toymaker that just look so abstract and weird that it removes everything you like or know about the original show. And I think as well, I could definitely see Ncuti Gatwa doing a Power of the Daleks style episode. And if anything, it would probably ground his Doctor more if he doesn't cry in it.
Yeah, that's
sorry,
been a
that's the criticism.
that's been a common criticism of Ncuti Gatwa. He cries a lot.
What do you think the current writers of the show could learn from the 60s, and would you like them to maybe focus on that era more?
I don't think they should rely too much on the past. I think in recent years they've not created anything new, or except for like messing with the the canon, you know, like the Timeless Child and all that.
Yes, yes.
But
The
we'll get
controversial.
onto that. We'll get onto that another episode.
Well, I was thinking in terms of, as you were saying, like Base Under Siege, or trying to not harken back in terms of like referencing the 60s, but trying to maybe condense their stories so that it feels more like Doctor Who, because I think the only modern writer to really understand Doctor Who inside out is probably Stephen Moffat. You know, he has had his fair share of hits and misses, but and obviously his Sherlock and Dracula adaptations are beyond awful, in my opinion. But he really kind of understood, especially when we got to Capaldi, he really sort of understood the classic era. And he did try and harken back in some ways, but try and reinvent those stories. Like, you know, we had a Base Under Siege two-parter, which, you know, is still one of a highly regarded episode. And he didn't mess around with the Master too much, but tried to reinvent the Master and do some interesting new things. So I think what I mean by sort of how the current writers could learn from the 60s is not having so many ideas that it feels like you're trying to put it in, like you're trying to make a film, but just trying to make a solid beginning to end story that makes sense, that pushes the series forward, maybe uses a mix of practical and special effects, because I do feel like the modern era way too much relies on CGI when you have all these studios that can make practical effects realistic, you know.
That they actually tried to do that in the colorized war games with the you know, the base, the
yes, yeah,
that's all model shots,
and
I,
that's amazing, because, you know, model shots are virtually unheard of in modern productions. You know, it's all CGI animated, and yet models do pretty much the same. I mean, they're called miniatures, but they're actually pretty big. But models achieve the same thing with less money. So you could be saving that money to go towards maybe hiring a higher paid guest actor, or actually getting some decent like writers on board, or, you know, that kind of thing.
I like model shots over CGI, so
well, we're both fans of Red Dwarf, so, you know, that's model shots galore.
Yeah, like yeah, most of it is
and I was just going to say, and there's been some defining classic Doctor Who episodes that have used model shots, like City of Death.
Yeah, the
spaceship.
The spaceship in the opening scene of the City of Death, and it just explodes. It looks very like something out of Star Wars, basically, kind of level.
I feel like it's a bit more like H.G. Wells meets Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, Doctor Who did have some like good model effects. I was watching
mm,
Warriors of the Deep earlier.
classic. Not for the right reasons, but still a classic.
But it's not a great story, but their model shots are.
Exactly. That's what you go to the story for the story, even though it's not great, but you stay for the model
Mm,
shots.
yeah. Yeah, the Warriors of the Deep is for a future episode, by the way.
Yeah, definitely. Um,
Yeah.
so who do you think is, let's remove the main cast for a second. Who do you believe are the sort of standout actors of this serial episode?
Um. Oh, what's her name? Lady Jennifer. Um.
Yeah, the nurse.
I do actually like her character, and it's actually a shame that she vanishes halfway through the story. I think she could have
Mm.
done some like good stuff with the rebels
Yeah, and maybe
later
her,
later on.
her. Yes, definitely.
I also like Carstairs,
Carstairs, yeah. The
the
the guy with the weird name, in my opinion.
yeah, and they all remind me of Blackadder characters.
Yeah, because of the World War One
Yeah,
feel and
they all remind me of Blackadder Goes Forth
I
with
just find the general. Sorry.
yeah, go on.
Oh no, I was gonna say, obviously us referencing Red Dwarf, I can't help but reference the fact that the general or colonel or whoever is the cat priest from the early dwarf series.
Mm,
And just how, because I've seen, I think it's Balance of Power, possibly Balance of Power. It's the one where Lister finds out he's God.
oh yeah,
a-
I know that episode.
and I just can't help but every time I see that general on the screen, I just think of the cat priest, and so my and I think that goes for a lot of classic Who actors that appeared in other BBC productions of that era.
Mm,
When you are so familiar with an actor from a different project, when you see them in a story that you're not as familiar with, it's that juxtaposition that really sort of takes you out.
um, also has Bernard Horsfall, who plays one of the Time Lords. He's been in like
Yeah,
a lot of like 70s Doctor Who episodes.
yeah.
Later on, I think he was in Planet of the Daleks. Um,
Is that the blonde guy?
yeah, Planet
Yeah,
of the
I
Daleks,
recognized him from something else.
and I think the Deadly Assassin as well.
I felt the music was quite good for modern Who, for classic Who as well. Like,
Oh, I
um,
love classic Who music. I can like
mm,
listen to it while I go shopping or something.
it's interesting because I think that's another strength that classic Who has over modern Who is you
Mm,
did have these composers that were working with very limited resources, having to create these really interesting sounds and atmospheres and
mm.
and
The
I think
B-
because Dudley Simpson did this one, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of the 1970, well, all of the 1970s, apart
Really?
bar a couple here and there.
Yeah. And I think that is the strength that Classic Who has, is every story feels unique because the sounds are unique to that story. Like
Mm,
you see in modern Who, and I think this is more of a criticism on, again, too much money being wasted on one particular thing, but you have scores that are repeated in the same episodes or continuously,
mm,
and it withdraws that idea of Doctor Who's meant to be an anthology. It's not meant to be this serial. It is serialized, but it's meant to be every episode is unique to each other, and every
mm,
story is unique, and therefore everything has to be unique. Whereas I feel like with the modern Who, they like to cut these corners and say, "Oh yeah, well, you just write 13 pieces of music, and then we'll just jiggle them around, and we'll just reuse them every so often." And I think that takes away from the idea of it being this, every episode is a brand new story and a brand new world, and that kind of thing.
that that's what I like about Classic Who as well. No
Mm.
score is all the same. Maybe
Mm.
during like the mid 1970s, but for the majority, each score is like different. While with New Who, it gets a bit samey with the same
Yeah.
composer.
And I
I
don't
think.
necessarily, because Murray Gold is one of my absolute favorite composers of all
Yeah,
time.
that's
He's
not.
created some. Sorry.
Yeah, that's not me shitting on him.
No, no, no. He's. I feel like he's one of the greatest composers that we've had on Who, and just in Britain in general, one of the greatest things. But again, I that's why I felt like, with Classic Who, it does get the edge on the better we all like to crap on Classic Who and say, oh, rubber monsters and flimsy sets and overacting and shot choices and all this sort of stuff, but it does have a higher degree of, it really does try to stick to its core belief of, let's do this episode and next week we'll go absolutely somewhere else, whether that be past, future, sci-fi, whatever.
And with the companions of this era, one's from the
Mm.
future and one's from the past, and
Yeah,
every new Who companion have been like, oh, she's like a early 20s
yeah,
modern day girl, usually
yeah.
blonde.
And
Um,
I feel like that's another reason why Classic Who again has that edge, is it wasn't afraid to say it never talked down to the audience. I feel like modern Who
mm,
does patronize, and again has that air of, oh, we have to appeal to as broad an audience as possible, which removes pretty much everyone, because if you make it as broad and bland as possible, you're not going to have these
mm,
iconic stories, iconic characters. The Fourth Doctor had a savage in his TARDIS, and then throughout that series, she learned to be more modern, or to she learned the skills, Leela. um
mm,
and then you had the first Doctor's first ever companion being not only his granddaughter, but a a child of Gallifrey, and you had from the onset this idea that the audience surrogate doesn't necessarily have to be someone from that time period. And I feel
Yeah.
like that's the problem with modern Who writers, is they want to play it safe too often, and therefore people get stuck in this idea of, well, it's good because they, and they make up excuses for that. Whereas with the classic Who, you can't really excuse it, but you can defend it by saying they stuck to their guns and they really decided to go different and be different. Like this set, this beautiful wooden set that they only used for one series or two series.
The Mask of Mandragora to I think
Deadly
the
Assassin.
Robots of Death, I think.
Yeah, but
I think
they decided to go, let's just have a wooden TARDIS for a series or two.
Yeah.
In modern Who, you'd have one constructed TARDIS, and it would go, right, we're using that until the Doctor leaves and we decide to do something else. You never really had. I think Capaldi was the only Doctor had to have slight changes in his console during his era, and obviously Smith had two, but
yeah.
you could, yeah. But yeah, did you want to discuss any more on the original serial, or?
I do have some notes.
Cool. Oh, excellent.
It's the final cameo of his recorder until like the Three Doctors. It appears in the Three Doctors and Castrovalva, and they actually use the sonic screwdriver for
as a screwdriver.
As a screwdriver. And I think it's the second appearance of the sonic screwdriver.
Well, it first appeared in Fury from the Deep, didn't it?
Yeah. Then he didn't use it as much, like the current Doctors, though, using it like a magic wand to get them out of stuff.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's something the classic writers, up until Davison, tried to balance out. The Doctor wouldn't always use a sonic screwdriver. In every episode, you'd probably have maybe one or two uses, but most of the time, they wanted the Doctor to just think on his feet. And the classic, the modern writers, almost see the sonic screwdriver as a crutch, or, I mean, RTD, I think, criticized. Oh no, it could be Chibnall. Basically, criticized the fact that the sonic screwdriver had been used so many times, and it's like, but you're the one writing it. You're the one putting the screwdriver in there. You could just not have the screwdriver. You could just say, oh, it doesn't work for this thing, or it doesn't work on wood, so why should it work on everything apart from wood? And they make the joke about, oh, well, you could put up shelves with it. Well, technically, it's a screwdriver. So I like the fact that they did use the screwdriver for its use in this episode, and actually they wrote it in such a clever way that it made the skeptical character convinced of the Doctor's legitimacy, as opposed to the Doctor just coming in and flashing a blank piece of paper and going, oh, I'm the Doctor, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That's another criticism, because I could criticize modern Who all day. I don't know whether that's necessarily helpful, but
Mm.
I do think that when you rewatch Classic Who, or when you watch Classic Who for the first time, you do see a real jump as to, oh well, Classic Who have taken all the best elements and sort of put them to the side,
Mm.
or tried to reinvent them, whilst holding on to some of the bad stuff and going, oh well, we need to have this.
Mm.
And that's what irritates me, because there are some classic stories that are always crapped on by modern Who fans because, oh, it's too inaccessible. No, you just need to have a better understanding of the show.
Mm. Yeah.
So shall we move on to the colorized?
Yeah.
Yeah. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on the colorized condensed version?
I like the colorization, but the stuff they cut out, I just find it very inconsistent.
Yeah.
I think they put too much out.
Yeah, because the War Games is almost a feature-length episode of Doctor Who, and I think if you are, when it comes to the colorization and you're condensing all the parts into one big episode, well, you may as well give it a feature-length. Not just 90 minutes, but push it to maybe 2 hours, 2.5.
Yeah.
Because you could have re-released it in cinemas and have it as a Doctor Who film, and caught some of those fans back to the show by saying, look, these Doctor Who episodes that we're colorizing, we could tempt you back in, but removing too much just doesn't work in the same way. Do you think the producers had the right to revise the history and change what the original writers and production staff had made? Like the War Chief being the Master, for example?
Well, Terrance Dicks was interviewed for, I think, one of the DVD documentaries. I think it's on the War Game DVD.
Like the
He says
commentary or something? Just an interview.
maybe a commentary or one of the documentaries on the disc, probably the making of. He said that the War Chief isn't the Master. They're two separate characters.
Like the Time Meddler or the Monk. The other Time Lord from the Hartnell story. He's not the Master.
Yeah. That the Rani isn't the Master.
Yeah, and Morbius and Omega.
Yeah. Are they gonna re-edit that? Are they gonna re-edit that and say he's the Master?
See, that's the problem. Is it kind of their revision of history and their revision of Classic Who? I don't think revising is necessarily the best route to go, because it's inserting your own opinion on something you shouldn't have an overall judgment over. And it goes contradictory to what RTD said about how the Doctor's origins are yours to imagine. You can imagine they're not they're a Gallifreyan. You can imagine they're a time. You can imagine they're half human. You can imagine they're what. But he kind of contradicts himself by saying, "Yeah, but I'm gonna make sure." I don't know. I think you said that Phil Collinson made the decision, but I will always hold RTD as responsible because it's his show.
Yeah, he made like a interview in Doctor Who magazine.
Yeah.
That newer fans won't sit down and watch a 10-part story. How do you know, though?
Well, it's just, again, it's inserting your opinion without backing it up with evidence.
Yeah, there's
don't
no.
don't just assume and don't push people off by saying it's a 10-part story. Just say it's an episode of Classic Who. Who cares if it's 10? Yes, okay, it's a massive story, but if you're going to condense it down anyway, but just that's the problem I have, is it kind of makes the universe smaller by having the War Chief being the Master.
Yeah.
And basically saying, oh well, he's behind this the entire time. And no, I like the idea of there being different Time Lords. I like the idea that maybe he's not the last. I mean, technically, because Chibnall revised Doctor Who lore, the Doctor isn't actually Gallifreyan. He's a different species. He just set the template.
Exactly.
I mean, that annoys me to high heaven. Because for me, I always imagined Time Lords are just a class of Gallifreyan,
Yeah.
Gallifreyan is just the species of that planet. Like you have the Shobogans, the Toboggans, the whatever. And I just thought Time Lord is a status. It's you ascend to the rank of a Time Lord. That just might be my own opinion, but I thought that was sort of consensus. And this is what I fear with these colorized, condensed episodes going forward, is I fear that they're going to play fast and loose with history, and they're going to take chances and opportunities to go, yeah, let's throw our own ideas into this, even though we weren't part of the original production staff, and we're kind of we're desecrating the legacy of those involved.
Yeah.
It'd be like, sorry, I just wanted to end. It'd be like digging up Hartnell's corpse and making him do the Doctor again. That's how I feel.
This isn't the first time they've tried to rewrite history, though. Remember the is it Children in Need special with Davros?
Is that the latest one?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was last year or the year before.
Yeah.
I don't know
Because sorry, you explain.
Yeah, they got rid of his wheelchair and his scars.
Yeah.
Again, a production company, a production team that is trying to rewrite Doctor Who history.
And I think that's the biggest threat to Doctor Who at the moment, is because people are too fixated on the whole ratings and audience watching and all this. And the biggest threat is RTD and his production team going, oh, well, that's too problematic, so we've got to change this and we've got to change that and we've got to... And, on the one hand, I can kind of see where they're coming from. But on the other, you've got to kind of just sort of take it on the chin and go, look, it's a part of the history. We can either not do it. So they had full right to go, right, we're not putting Davros in any more stories, which probably would be the better idea. Or maybe do Davros stories before the accident. That would be interesting because you get to see more of the Dalek city, more of the lore, expand upon that part of history that is relegated to the Big Finish verse. And I watched the special, and afterwards I thought it was funny. It was all right. It was good for what it was. But I don't want that to be the gold standard going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, there was no complaints before they did that.
Well,
either.
it's yeah. I mean, I can understand because it is a trope, the disabled, disfigured villain trope, but the way they did it in Doctor Who, he was actually supposed to be. I think Davros was more sort of sympathetic to begin with because you sort of felt bad about this guy, and then his evilness sort of grew over his appearances. He just got more and more insane. But the thing is, RTD did an episode with Davros in a wheelchair. No complaints there.
Exactly.
So I understand that things change, culture changes over time. But if it wasn't a problem for RTD to begin with, and in the behind the scenes, you do see the fact that he's actually loving the idea of having Davros, and doing that redesign to make him look modernized, but still keeping the core elements that, because technically he should be just a head.
Yeah, in Revelations of the Daleks.
Yeah.
He's just a head. Because he doesn't have any.
He's magically grown a body back. Where did that happen? And I think going forward, I think the fans need to be more vocal and need to push back more against this revising of history, because it's the fans that brought the series back. It's the fans that ideally you want to keep on board. Again, like with the Daleks in color, I didn't mind the colorization. In fact, it's fun to watch these stories in a new light. But when you start messing with history and you start going, I'm going to add my own fan fiction in, and we're going to get rid of problematic elements, well, now you're just sort of changing it to please no one and to be as broad as possible and bland. And unfortunately, that's what happens when a show gets too mainstream. It just becomes bland and boring. And then people hate it, and then it dies. Doctor Who serviced a niche back in the classic era. It was very niche, but it had a very loyal niche.
Yeah, I feel the Daleks actually what's the word, made it flow a little more better than the 7-part story, because it was a bit of a slog. It was.
And obviously you had like the film version with Peter Cushing, and I think they added more elements in or took elements out. And obviously we'll get to that at some point.
Yeah, I'd rather watch the first Dalek film more than that I do with the actual episode. I just find it very hard going. And I think Daleks' Invasion of Earth is actually a better story than the Daleks.
But
It
I think
it flows better.
I think when you think about, you know, the legacy that, you know, program had, that episode, it stayed tested and true to, you know, yes, it was slow at parts, but it was revolutionary for its time. And again, modern writers are too scared to make a good Dalek story now, because they think every Dalek story's been told when there's more things to do. And I think that's where the whole classic era just went, let's just do this story, and if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, we'll move on next week and do something else. Whereas I feel like modern writers are too fixated in, this has to be make or break, or we're going to lose fans, or people are going to scream and shout at us, and we're going to get really, really, you know, thrown in the mud. And it's like, you've got to be thrown in the mud to be able to be better, you know. Chibnall had a lot of criticism during his time, but you kind of felt that towards the end of his era, he was starting to try and turn things around. You know, not every story of his was trash, but, you know, he was actually trying.
Yeah, they were watchable. Let's say, among like the greatest stories ever, but some of them, about 10-20% of them, were watchable.
Same with Classic Who. You know, not every story is watchable. Some stories are a slog to get through, but there are diamonds in the rough.
So some of them, I'd happily just sit down and watch, even the bad stories from Classic Who.
Do you feel like? Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was gonna say, do you feel like with Classic Who, the way they tackled historicals? Obviously, in the 60s, they were more. In the Hartnell era, there were more more historicals, because it was meant to be educational. But do you think that in broader terms, Classic Who had the advantage on historicals because they didn't just focus on England or America? You know, we had a bit of France, we had a bit of Rome, like Italy, we had a bit of Mongolia. You know, I feel like we went to more places.
Yeah, it was all in one country, wasn't it?
Whereas nowadays, I feel like it's either it's like Victorian London or Cardiff, or let's go to the US, and again, it's become that Americanized trash where you're not really exploring history. You're just sort of going, let's go to this time period and have some wacky hijinks.
Yeah, that they're all always in their little Cardiff bubble and don't actually expand on the storytelling. Like they don't go like more like different planets either. As New Who, Classic Who did.
Yeah. So that's the War Games. What would you rate this episode?
I'd rate it around about an 8.5, maybe.
Okay, I would say maybe 7.5 to an 8. Just to be a bit fairer. Like, yeah.
It's about an 8 to an 8.5 for me. It's in the bottom 20.
It could have been better, but it was good enough.
Yeah, I I think I have to be in the mood to watch this story.
Mm,
Compared to
definitely.
like other stories, like Spearheads from Space after it,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
most of like the Pertwee era and the Baker era, and some
The golden era.
yeah, and some Troughton stories I'd watch more than this story, like
Interesting.
like like the Mind Robber or Tomb of the Cybermen or the Macra Terror. I like the Macra Terror.
Yes. Yeah. That again, a classic monster they brought back and ruined.
Oh yeah.
And yet that episode's just a classic. It's just balls to the wall, insane weirdness.
Though I do kind of like Gridlock as a story, but that's for another episode.
So what else happened in 1969? Or,
Well,
around
1969, we had the Vietnam War happening around that time.
yes, yeah.
Civil rights. It was quite a violent time to be alive, really.
Mm. Well, it was a revolution for what would become, modern, like new wave feminism. You'd have like art and culture being more sort of postmodern or pushing that edge. You had, I think it was 68 maybe, but you did have Led Zeppelin releasing their first album.
Or was it
And
69?
was it 69? Let me just Google. Led Zeppelin.
Do you know what the number one song was?
69. I did not know the number one song, but it is 69. So you're right. Led Zeppelin's first
Mm.
album.
Something called Aquarius and Let the Sunshine In.
Let the Sun Shine. What singer? Musician?
Um,
I thought it'd be a Beatles as number
the
one.
the Flesh Failures or something like that. I don't
Interesting.
know.
What was like the number one movie then of
Uh,
1969?
the number one movie.
Obviously, we cannot say 2001: A Space Odyssey because that was the year before. But I have a fun fact about that film that relates to Doctor Who.
I'm just actually looking that one up.
Yeah.
Around when the story aired was the Love Bug. You know, the Herbie movie.
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, and Bullet was in the cinema around that
Steve
time as
McQueen.
well. Yeah, that was like a month or a few months before.
And not the writer director, but the actor who I got confused with recently. There's too
Yeah,
many Steve McQueens.
I thought he got resurrected or something.
Yeah,
When
literally.
I first seen him on a movie poster, I was like, Steve McQueen. Um, Oliver was in the cinema
Science
when
is weird. Oh yes, Oliver Twist.
yeah, the 60s musical. Yeah, that was in the
Yeah,
cinema at the time. The Killing of
we
Sister
had.
George and something called The Longest Day as well.
Think I've heard of that. I think you're forgetting one major event of 1969 that, I mean, relates quite well to Doctor Who.
What's that?
The moon landings.
Ah, yes. That was
July.
was that July? It was like
I think it was late July. But Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and it was not filmed on a soundstage, contrary to unpopular belief.
yeah, soundstage in New York.
It's Kubrick just working away. No, that the moon landings were real, and it's still one of the greatest things humanity has ever achieved. And made it so that science fiction was less fiction. We had the ability. We beat the Soviets in the space race.
Mm-hmm. Was it just science then?
Was it what?
Was it just science then, not fiction?
Well, I think yeah. It was genuinely just science. The fiction came after. So yeah, that was what happened in. Oh, actually, no, that was 3 years prior. I was going to say England World Cup. That was 66.
Yeah, that was 1966.
Yeah, the first and only ever time that we've won the World Cup. What a sorry state of affairs for British sport.
Oh, and also Her Majesty's Secret Service came out of that year as well.
Oh, was that Connery or was that Lazenby?
That was Lazenby.
Lazenby. I'm not a massive Bond fan, so.
I
have I've watched less Bond than I have Doctor Who.
I do actually like the James Bond movies.
And there's probably cause to reference James Bond in Doctor Who podcast in the future, because I think there's actors that have appeared in that.
Yeah, there are some Doctor Who cast members who have appeared in James Bond. Honor Blackman, Diana Rigg. Who else? Sorry.
I was just saying interesting.
I can't think of any others.
No, I'm honestly I'm more lost in the dark than I've ever been. But it was a fun discussion talking about the war games. What's lined up for next time, Sam?
Well, the next time is 1974-75 story, Robot.
Ooh, Robot. Very accurate set for that.
Which was your first
you never know.
Doctor Who story, classic Doctor Who story.
Yes. I'll talk more about that in the next episode, but yes. It was the first of what would be the best launching into classic Who.
Yeah.
And I can't wait. It's the golden age of Who. So we've gone from what would you say, the Silver Age?
What, the 60s?
The 60s. Yeah. I see it as the Silver Age.
Yeah, the Silver Age.
And then golden age is the 70s.
Oh yeah. I love the 70s.
And then the 80s is a bit bronze.
Yeah. And
or would you say brown?
And the new stuff being carpet or plastic.
Yeah.
Or is that too harsh?
Oh, I think if anything, if this podcast goes well, we may find that our audience agrees with us more as we rip into Modern Who, even though I'm a vessel for Modern Who. I do correspond more with the classic era than I do modern up until about 2018.
Yeah, the first like 6 years of New Who is like my
It's
bit.
a mini golden era.
Mm,
But we'll get onto that next time.
Yeah, we'll get onto that. Well, probably not next time. Maybe the time after.
The time after, yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
We've got over 1,000 episodes to explore. I mean, more if you include Big Finish.
Exactly. Which we'll dive in. Anyway, see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you for watching. And subscribe. Subscribe.
Click that like button as well.
Yeah. Anywhere on the screen. Just subscribe. Just do it.